Welcome to this time of worship. Today is the third Sunday in the season of Advent, a Sunday when those of us who light Advent candles light the third Advent candle, which is traditionally pink. I'm just using candles that I have here at home, and so I did find a scrap of pink ribbon to tie around the third candle to signify its pinkness. It's pink traditionally because the word for today is joy, Latin gaudete, and the pink just evokes that sense of joy. It stands out. And today we hear a story. We remember a young woman's song. And I invite you to imagine along with me a young woman, a young girl going about her daily routine, tending to animals, finishing her chores around the house, maybe working in the garden, perhaps returning home from a visit to the market or from a visit to the well to collect the day's water, perhaps preparing herself and maybe a small meal for a visit from her fiance, Joseph. Mary was a young girl, the scriptures tell us, a young woman. And so she may have been babysitting younger children in the village, perhaps playing hide and seek with them or tag, enjoying a carefree day with her people when a messenger arrived. And the messenger wasn't from Amazon or UPS or Western Union. This messenger had a name. His name was Gabriel, and his job was to deliver messages for God. Gabriel was not even finished with his formal greeting of Mary before it was clear that she was confused and perplexed. I imagine that Gabriel was used to this kind of response, this kind of reaction when he showed up on the scene, because he just kept right on going with his message. It went something like this: chin up. God is delighted in you. So you will carry a baby in your belly, and it's going to be a boy. And by the way, the name is already picked out. He's going to be named Jesus. Mary may have been young, but she wasn't so young that she didn't know how babies were made and when babies should be made. When Gabriel paused to take an angelic breath, Mary protested. Impossible, she said. Do you know how old I am? Do you know anything about me and my life? No problem, responded Gabriel. God will take care of all the details. Oh, did I mention that this baby will be holy, like the Son of God? And that I've just come from seeing one of your relatives, Elizabeth. Yeah, she's pregnant too. Old ladies, young unmarried girls, God can do anything. Mary's response gives us a little bit of insight into why she may have been the one chosen to carry the child of God in her belly. She said, okay, I serve God with my life, so okay. The Gospel of Luke doesn't give us any clues about what happened immediately following Gabriel's visit. Did Mary tell her mother and father? Did she race to the home of her best friend? Or did she curl up in a ball on her sleeping mat and try to convince herself it was just a strange dream? We just don't know what happened immediately. The writer of Luke picks up a little bit later after some time has passed, and he picks up with Mary's journey to visit her cousin Elizabeth. Elizabeth is the elder relative that Gabriel had proclaimed pregnant in his message to Mary. It may have been that Mary was curious about the angel's proclamation, or perhaps she hoped that Elizabeth would offer her support or insight, wisdom, care, welcome, advice. When Mary arrived and greeted Elizabeth, the baby in Elizabeth's belly began to dance. Filled with God's Spirit, Elizabeth immediately recognized the truth about Mary and the truth about the baby that she was carrying her. The truth sprang up from within her and spilled out in a joyful song. Elizabeth said, of all women, Mary, you are most blessed. Of all babies, Mary, the one in your womb is most blessed. This is unbelievable. This is beyond words because you believe, Mary, because you believe that God is faithful to God's promises. You are blessed. And in that moment, the truth sprang up from within Mary, the joy of being filled with the Spirit of God, and it spilled out in a song. Listen to this song. I'm sharing it from the Message paraphrase. Mary sang, I'm bursting with God news. I'm dancing the song of my Savior God. God took one look at me, and look what happened. I'm the most fortunate woman on the earth. What his God has done for me will never be forgotten. The God whose very name is holy, set apart from all others. God's mercy flows in wave after wave after wave on those who live in awe of God. God bared God's arm and showed divine strength, scattering the bluffing braggarts. God knocked the tyrants off of their high horses and pulled victims up out of the mud. The starving sat down to a banquet. The callous rich were left out in the cold. God embraced God's child, Israel. God remembered and piled upon mercy on mercy on mercy, piled them high. It is exactly what God promised, beginning with Abraham right up to now. Mary's song of response here has been sung by individuals and choirs throughout the ages, often called the Magnificat. This passage has been arranged and rearranged for those of us who are fed by traditional expressions of worship music, and for those of us for whom contemporized music is most nourishing. It's a song of wonder and joy. And those of us who hear it all of these generations later may surely ask ourselves, how could Mary, how could Elizabeth, how could these women be so unrestrained in their joy? Pregnancy and old age, pregnancy prior to marriage, both high risk situations. And yet, the first line of Mary's song, I'm bursting with God news, or my soul magnifies the Lord. Newly pregnant, there's no doubt that Mary's physical body was changing, was being transformed. Yet it's her spirit, her soul that sing this statement of confession, of praise, of commitment. She and Elizabeth, in spite of all that is mysterious and uncertain, in spite of all that is dangerous and inexplicable, they are able to sow joy. When I was in high school, I participated in Toastmasters and I competed in several statewide Toastmasters speaking tournaments. One year, my speech was titled An Explosion of Joy, and it began something like this. Joy is described by the Random House Dictionary as great delight, happiness, or elation caused by something exceptionally good. I can't remember the rest of that speech, even though it consumed my every waking moment for many, many months. Joy, an expression of great delight, happiness, or elation caused by something exceptionally good. Mary and Elizabeth, in the presence of the exceptionally good news that God was keeping God's promise, could not contain their delight, their happiness, their elation, their joy. Mary's joy did not remain focused on her personal sense of blessedness, on the ways that God's faithfulness to God's promise would benefit her and hers. The seed that started with the news that God chose her to carry and give birth to the Messiah was rooted then in her trust in God's promise and grew because of Mary's remembrance that God's faithfulness, that God's dream was not only for her, but was for all people. Most of the lines of Mary's song have to do with God's blessing, not of her, but of others. Line after line of God's mercy for those who suffer, God's power in dethroning those who abuse power, God raising up those who have been trampled, God's feeding of the hungry, God turning the world upside down. True confessions. This makes me squirm a little bit. If I wrote a song, if I allowed my spirit, my soul to burst forth in joy, the bulk of it would have to do with all that God has done for me. My magnifying of the Lord would end up being a magnification of Melissa, leaving any hearers with the sense that God's redeeming work was and is all about me, is only a personal experience. And of course, God's mercy is for me, but not any more or any less than God's mercy is for you and every other creature. And God's turning the world on its head holds you and I no more or less accountable than it does the stranger, or those who vote differently, or those who perpetuate what offends you, or those who seem to have it all together. The dream of God not only includes all, it connects us, each to the other, friend and stranger, partner and enemy. For me, it's easy to sow joy when things are going right. When I or you know that God is blessing us with deliverance, with wisdom, with health, with clarity. When God's dream seems to line up perfectly with our own. But when God starts messing with the order of things, bringing pregnancy to old barren women and young unmarried women, knocking power mongers off their high horses, setting up lavish banquets for the unwashed, closing the door on the hard-hearted, embracing the poor in divine grace. When God starts messing with the order of things, our joy may recede in fear. Will I get knocked off my horse? Will I have a door slammed in my face? What about me? It's very difficult to sow joy when things are not going our way and when we're no longer certain of our place in God's good news. Mary's song demonstrates that joy is sown when we offer ourselves completely to God's dream. I need to say that again. Mary's song demonstrates to us that joy is sown within us when we offer ourselves completely to God's dream. Of course, we know the elation and delight of joy when God blesses us, but that's just the beginning of God's dream. God's full dream, God's perfect promise is of a reality where the low are lifted up, the powerful are brought down, the hungry eat their fill, and the wealthy who hoard are separated from their riches. This is the dream of the God many of us worship. And Advent's call is for us to carry that dream, as did Mary, into the world. A dream that is born of God and humanity, a dream that sees a new heaven and a new earth where Lions, lambs, wolves, and children play together. A dream that surely disrupts our lives and our ideologies as it did Mary's, with its assertion that the way that the world is not the way it should be, and by God, it's not the way it will be. I shared a bit ago one dictionary's definition of joy: great delight, happiness, or elation caused by something exceptionally good. I hope you can agree with me that God's goodness is exceptionally good. And I hope that you and I can both allow Mary's song to teach us that trusting in God's exceptional goodness sows joy, delight, elation, happiness, not only within us, not only for us, but within all and for all. Joy, like most nouns, has an antonym: misery. Our inability or unwillingness to trust in God's dream and to offer ourselves as carriers of that dream can sow misery. Our moping around because things aren't the way they used to be, or they're not the way they should be. Our saying or thinking things like, oh my gosh, I'm so tired of hearing about poverty, systemic racism, corruption, discrimination, whatever. Carrying misery around inside of us and feeding it with concerns about how God's new heaven and new earth will impact us. And if you're like me, you don't necessarily even know that you're doing it, this sowing of misery. If you're like me, it may have become your default reaction in this season of reactivity. Maybe you've begun to doubt the trustworthiness of God or the potentiality of God's dream ever being fulfilled. Friends, let us allow Mary to sing into our misery and flagging joy today. Let's choose to sow some joy. Any of us who are gardeners know that sowing seeds is always an act of faith. Some seeds don't do anything, no matter how we tend them, no matter how nicely we talk to them. And sure, when we sow any seed, we are imagining the fruitful tomato plant or the towering sunflower. But in the moment of sowing, we're taking one small step, one of the first steps toward fulfilling our grand agricultural dreams. What if we sowed joy with the same heart? What if we imagined the world turned upside down, restored to God's new heaven and new earth, and take one step, one first small step, by trusting God's promise to make all things right in your life, your work, your school, in your relationships? Where can you sprinkle joy this week? Who in the world needs you to sing Mary's song of deliverance for all? Who in the world needs you to see them as God sees them, a recipient of God's mercy and justice, as much a part of God's new heaven and new earth as you? This week, may you sow joy. May you experience God's trustworthy faithfulness to God's own promise to restore all things. May you be willing to carry the Christ child within you and sow that joy out into the world. May you bless others and be blessed. Amen.